Grace Donovan was 28 years old when her mother sent her a bill for $347,000. The subject line read, "The cost of raising a disappointment." Before I continue, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has subscribed and supported this channel. I am truly grateful. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. It's completely free. We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single click truly makes a difference. Like this video and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Diane Donovan copied 48 relatives on the email, from California to Maine, and pressed send at 8:02 a.m. on Mother's Day. Grace read it during her morning coffee in her small Somerville apartment, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors she paid for herself.
She didn't cry. She didn't reply.
She read every line twice, absorbing the cold precision of the itemized list: hospital fees, school clothes, braces, summer camps, even birthday cakes. It was theatrical, humiliating, and carefully timed. Diane had already announced a full family reunion that afternoon at Margaret Donovan's farmhouse in Connecticut. Everyone was expected. Grace stared at her phone for a long moment, then set it face down. Across the kitchen, Ethan Brooks watched her quietly. "You don't have to go," he said. Grace inhaled slowly. "I do," she answered, not out of obligation, but because she had prepared for something like this years ago. Grace worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized accounting firm in Boston. Numbers grounded her. They followed rules and revealed patterns without emotion.
She had learned early that people did not.
She had moved out at 22, covered her own rent, paid down her own student loans, and built her credit from scratch after discovering mistakes that were not hers. Her older sister, Olivia Donovan, lived a different life. Olivia had recently purchased a 4-bedroom colonial in Wellesley with an $80,000 gift from their parents for the down payment. Grace had found out through social media. When Grace graduated magna cum laude from Boston University, her mother sent a text 3 weeks late.
No exclamation mark.
No phone call. Edward Donovan, her father, had been present at graduation, clapping loudly in the crowd. Diane had claimed a migraine that morning. 1 week later, she flew to New York for Olivia's firm award ceremony and posted 12 glowing photos online. Grace never complained.
She adjusted.
She invested in herself quietly, believing that independence was safer than expectation.
The pattern had begun long before adulthood.
Olivia was praised for effort. Grace was questioned about perfection. When both girls turned 18, their grandparents had established equal education trusts, $89,000 each. Margaret and her late husband worried that Diane struggled with financial discipline, so Diane was listed as trustee only until each daughter reached legal age. Olivia's tuition was paid smoothly, and she graduated debt-free. Grace was told her fund had dried up early due to tutoring and extracurricular expenses. At 17, Diane had been pregnant and frightened. At 45, she still carried that fear like a secret bruise. Grace had accepted the explanation at the time.
She signed student loan papers without protest.
It wasn't until 3 years earlier, after IRS letters and unexpected credit report issues forced her to consult a CPA, that she began tracing transactions.
Bank records told a different story.
The entire trust had been withdrawn 1 month before she started college and transferred into Diane's personal account. 1 week later, Diane purchased a new Lexus in cash. Grace did not confront her mother immediately. Instead, she documented everything. The CPA uncovered 6 consecutive tax filings where Diane had claimed Grace as a dependent long after she had moved out and paid her own expenses. Diane had access to Grace's social security number from childhood records and used it without permission. The improper filings generated thousands in tax benefits and triggered federal notices addressed to Grace. Then there were the credit cards, 3 accounts opened under Grace's name between 2016 and 2018, all maxed out. Packages had been delivered to Olivia's address. Designer bags, electronics, jewelry. Grace spent 4 years disputing charges, hiring attorneys, and repairing the damage. She saved every statement, every receipt, every confirmation signature. She built a digital folder titled Insurance.
She never mentioned it at holidays. She never raised her voice at Thanksgiving. She waited.
Not for revenge, but for clarity. Mother's Day, with 48 witnesses present, felt less like coincidence and more like strategy. Margaret Donovan's farmhouse stood white and steady against the Connecticut hills, a house that had hosted decades of family gatherings. Grace arrived at 7 in the morning to help prepare. She arranged flowers, set 48 place settings, and moved chairs while Diane supervised with polished efficiency. Olivia arrived just before noon in a cream dress, carrying expensive peonies. "Everything looks perfect, Mom," she said warmly. Diane smiled and accepted the compliment without mentioning who had done the work. When relatives filled the porch for photographs, Diane positioned Olivia beside her and directed Grace to stand in the back row.
"You're taller," she said lightly.
Margaret stepped beside Grace and squeezed her arm. "Whatever happens today," she murmured, "stand steady." Grace didn't yet know what her grandmother suspected, but she felt it, an undercurrent beneath the surface politeness. By lunchtime, the house buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Diane rose to deliver her Mother's Day toast, phone already in her hand. Diane waited until dessert plates were cleared before standing. Conversations softened immediately. She had always known how to command a room. "Motherhood," she began, lifting her glass, "is the most expensive investment you'll ever make."
A few relatives chuckled politely.
Grace felt the shift before it happened.
Diane pulled out her phone.
"Since we're all here," she continued, smiling in a way that never reached her eyes, "I thought I'd share something honest." Phones buzzed across the table in near unison. Grace heard it, the chain reaction of notifications spreading through the room.
48 screens lit up.
Grace didn't reach for hers. She already knew.
Diane's voice sharpened.
The total cost of raising Grace Donovan, $347,000.
A murmur rippled through the dining room. Hospital bills. Braces. Private math tutoring. College housing.
She glanced at Grace.
And not a single thank you. Silence thickened.
Grace felt eyes turn toward her, waiting for tears, for apology. Instead, she folded her hands calmly in front of her and stood. "Since we're sharing numbers," Grace said evenly, "I'd like to share a few of mine." The calm in her voice shifted the temperature of the room. Diane laughed softly. "Grace, this isn't necessary."
Grace ignored her.
"Everyone still has their phones," she asked the table.
Several nodded, uncertain.
She tapped her screen and pressed send. Another round of notifications filled the air. "What did you just send?"
Diane demanded. "Documentation," Grace replied.
Uncle Robert opened the first attachment and frowned. "Diane, what is this transfer?"
Grace spoke clearly.
"My college trust contained $8,000 to $9,000. It was withdrawn in full 1 month before I started school and deposited into my mother's personal account."
She paused only long enough for the wait to settle.
1 week later, she purchased a Lexus in cash. Diane's face drained. That money was for family expenses. Grace didn't blink. The bank statements show otherwise.
Edward slowly set down his fork.
"Diane," he said carefully, "is that true?" She opened her mouth, but Grace continued before she could redirect. "That's only part one."
The room had gone completely still now.
Even the children had stopped moving in the hallway. For 6 consecutive years after I moved out, my mother claimed me as a dependent on her federal taxes.
Uncle George leaned forward.
"You were living independently?"
"Yes," Grace answered.
"Paying rent, insurance, tuition, everything." She turned slightly so more people could see her phone. She had access to my social security number from childhood records. The filings generated thousands in tax benefits under my name. Diane's voice rose. "You agreed to that arrangement?"
Grace met her eyes.
"I have email confirmation from the IRS stating I did not." Edward stood now, anger tightening his posture.
"Why would you do that?"
Diane's composure began to crack.
Grace opened the third file.
"There were also 3 credit cards opened under my name between 2016 and 2018.
Aunt Patricia covered her mouth. "No," she whispered. "All maxed out.
$4,000 to $7,000 in charges."
Grace scrolled.
"Designer purchases shipped to Olivia's address."
Olivia stiffened.
"I didn't." Grace held up a hand. "The delivery confirmations carry your signature." Derek, Olivia's husband, stared at her hand, at the diamond ring catching light. Grace's voice remained steady. "Including an engagement ring purchased with a card in my name." The silence was heavier now, no more polite discomfort, only reckoning. "I spent 4 years clearing that debt," Grace continued. "Lawyers, disputes, audits. Every document is attached." Diane stepped toward her. "You're trying to destroy this family."
Grace's reply came quietly. "No.
I'm correcting the record." Diane's expression shifted from outrage to desperation. "You don't understand," she said, voice trembling. "You don't know why things were different with you." The statement hung in the air. Grace felt it land like a prelude. "Then explain," she said. Diane glanced around the room, calculating. "Some truths protect people." Grace inhaled once and opened the final file she had kept hidden for 3 years. 3 years ago, she said calmly, Olivia left her phone on the kitchen counter. A message preview appeared with my name. Olivia's face went pale. Grace pressed send. Phones chimed again. Diane lunged forward. "Delete it." "Too late." Uncle Robert read aloud under his breath, then stopped. Edward's voice broke the silence. "Diane, what does this mean?" On every screen was a screenshot of a text Diane had sent Olivia. "Grace isn't Edward's biological child. Don't tell him. If he finds out, I lose everything." Edward didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply walked out the front door. The front door closed with a firm, final sound that echoed through the house. No one moved at first. Edward's empty chair sat at the head of the table like a verdict. Diane looked smaller suddenly, her posture collapsing as the performance drained from her face. "It's not what it looks like," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Olivia stared at her phone, tears streaking her makeup. "You told me he could never know," she whispered. "You said it would ruin everything." Grace stood still in the center of the room, her pulse steady. The humiliation Diane had planned had reversed direction, and now it was moving through the room in slow waves. Aunt Patricia shook her head. "You let that man raise her for 28 years without telling him." Uncle George spoke more bluntly. "You committed fraud and lied about paternity." Diane's eyes found Grace, searching for weakness, for mercy. Grace offered neither. "You treated me like evidence," she said quietly. "Not like a daughter." Margaret rose from her chair with deliberate calm. She did not rush to Diane's side. Instead, she stepped forward and faced her daughter squarely. "I suspected something was wrong years ago," she said. "Not this, but something." Diane looked at her mother as if betrayed. "You're going to take her side?" Margaret's expression hardened. "This is not about sides. This is about truth." Around them, relatives gathered coats and purses, murmuring in disbelief. Some approached Grace briefly, touching her arm, offering apologies for years of silence. Grace accepted them with a nod but did not linger. Her attention remained on Diane. "You could have told him," Grace said evenly. "You could have handled it privately at any point." Diane wiped her face with shaking hands. "I was 17 when I got pregnant," she said. "I was terrified." Grace's reply was steady. "Being afraid at 17 doesn't excuse what you did at 4 to 5. Outside, the driveway filled with engines starting and doors closing. The gathering dissolved in less than 20 minutes. Inside, Diane sat alone on the couch, mascara streaked, breathing unevenly. "Are you satisfied?" she asked Grace hoarsely. Grace considered the question. "I'm relieved," she answered. "There's a difference." Margaret approached Grace and squeezed her hand. "Come see me tomorrow morning," she said quietly. 9 o'clock. Grace nodded. She stepped outside and scanned the driveway until she found Edward's car parked near the gate. He hadn't left. She walked over and tapped on the passenger window. He unlocked the door without speaking. They sat side by side in silence for a long moment. Edward's hands gripped the steering wheel. "Is it true?" he asked finally. Grace met his eyes. "I didn't know either." He swallowed. "DNA doesn't change 28 years. Grace's composure faltered for the first time that day. Edward exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with disbelief. "I loved you before you were born," he said. "Nothing about today changes that." Grace felt tears rise, not from shame but from something steadier, recognition. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. He shook his head. "You didn't." His gaze drifted back toward the house. "She had decades to tell me." After a long pause, he started the engine. "I can't go back inside right now." Grace nodded. "I understand." He reached over and squeezed her hand once, firm and certain. "You're my daughter," he said. Then he drove away. Grace stood in the gravel driveway until the car disappeared down the road. When she returned inside, the farmhouse felt quieter, almost hollow. Diane was gone from the living room. Only Margaret remained, watching her granddaughter carefully. "It had to come out," Margaret said. Grace didn't answer.
She was already thinking about what would come next.
The next morning, Grace arrived at Margaret's house just before 9. The farmhouse looked orderly again, as if the chaos had been carefully folded away. In the study, Margaret sat behind her desk with a stack of documents neatly arranged. Beside her stood Samuel Reed, the family's estate attorney. Grace sensed the gravity immediately.
"I didn't block your mother," Margaret said without preamble.
"Blocking her would have been temporary."
She slid a document across the desk.
"This is permanent."
Grace scanned the page. Margaret's will had been revised at 4 that morning.
Diane's share had been reduced significantly, enough to prevent legal challenge but unmistakably diminished.
Grace's portion had increased. "This isn't punishment," Margaret said.
"It's accountability." She reached into a drawer and handed Grace an envelope. Inside was a check dated years earlier, intercepted, never delivered. Grace looked up, understanding settling slowly. The consequences were no longer emotional.
They were structural.
Grace left Margaret's study with the envelope secured in her bag and a new understanding settling into place. The previous day had exposed truth. This morning formalized consequences. By the end of the week, Edward moved out of the family home and filed for divorce. The process was quiet, handled by attorneys rather than arguments. Diane called relatives repeatedly, but most did not answer. The documents Grace had shared were factual, time-stamped, and verifiable. There was little room for reinterpretation.
Grace did not celebrate.
She returned to work Monday morning and completed her quarterly financial review as scheduled. Her focus felt sharper, not distracted. Ethan asked her that night whether she felt guilty.
She considered the question carefully. "No," she said.
"But I don't feel triumphant either." What she felt was relief, an absence of tension she had carried for years without realizing its weight. The damage had not begun with her.
It had simply ended there.
3 days later, Olivia asked to meet. They chose a quiet cafe halfway between Boston and Wellesley. Olivia arrived without makeup, hair pulled back, posture subdued. "I didn't know about the trust," she began. "Or the taxes. I only knew about the credit cards after the first year."
Grace listened without interruption.
"Mom told me it was temporary," Olivia continued.
"She said you'd agreed."
Grace shook her head slightly. "I didn't."
Olivia swallowed.
"I should have asked questions. I didn't because I was afraid she'd turn on me." The honesty was uncomfortable but direct. "You protected yourself," Grace said evenly. "At my expense."
Olivia nodded.
"Yes." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no embrace.
Only acknowledgement.
"I need time," Grace added. "I'm not cutting you off. But I'm not pretending nothing happened." Olivia accepted that boundary without argument. For the first time, their conversation was not shaped by their mother's influence. Over the following weeks, Grace's credit score climbed steadily now that the fraudulent accounts were permanently removed. She made a substantial payment toward her remaining student loans using the recovered funds Margaret provided. Not to erase the past, but to reduce its grip. Sunday dinners became a new ritual with Edward. Sometimes Ethan joined. Sometimes it was just father and daughter discussing work, books, and ordinary life. Edward began therapy at his attorney's suggestion, determined not to let anger define the next chapter of his life. He never once distanced himself from Grace. If anything, he grew more intentional. "Biology doesn't dictate loyalty," he told her one evening. "Choice does." Grace understood that better than she ever had before. The identity crisis she feared did not consume her. The foundation she had built for herself, career, friendships, relationship, remained stable. 2 months after Mother's Day, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a brief note from David Mercer. He explained that after distant relatives discussed the family situation in a private social media group, he had taken a DNA test out of quiet curiosity. The results indicated a biological connection. He emphasized he was not seeking money, recognition, or disruption. "I simply wanted you to know I exist," he wrote. Grace read the letter twice before showing it to Ethan. "What do you want?" he asked gently. She considered it overnight. The next morning, she wrote back with measured clarity. She appreciated his honesty but needed time. The reply was respectful and restrained. There was no urgency in it, no pressure. Grace realized something important in that exchange. She did not owe anyone immediate access to her life, not even someone connected by blood. Diane appeared outside Grace's office building on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked thinner, less polished, stripped of the composure she once wore like armor.
"We need to talk," she said when Grace approached. Grace stopped at a careful distance. "This isn't the place," Diane insisted.
Grace's tone remained level. "There isn't a place."
Diane's voice trembled.
"I made mistakes.
I was scared. I thought I was protecting everyone."
Grace held her gaze. "You were protecting yourself." There was no anger in her delivery, only certainty. Diane stepped closer. "You can't cut me out forever." Grace replied calmly, "That depends on your actions." She outlined her boundary clearly. No surprise visits, no contact with her employer, no attempts to manipulate relatives against her. "If those conditions are violated," she added, "I'll pursue legal remedies." Diane recognized the finality in her daughter's voice. For once, she did not argue. Grace drove home that evening without shaking hands, without second-guessing herself. Ethan greeted her at the door and listened quietly as she recounted the encounter. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question carefully before answering.
"Clear."
That word surprised her. The situation had not erased pain, but it had removed confusion.
She no longer wondered why she had been treated differently.
She no longer internalized labels that never belonged to her. Margaret called every Wednesday, steady and direct. Edward remained consistent. Olivia respected the distance Grace requested. Life did not return to what it had been. It reorganized into something healthier. The chaos of that single afternoon had forced long-avoided truths into daylight, and daylight, Grace realized, was not destructive.
It was clarifying.
Months later, Grace stood in her Cambridge apartment beside Ethan, reviewing engagement rings displayed across his laptop screen. It was an ordinary evening. Quiet, uncomplicated, chosen. Her phone buzzed occasionally with work emails and dinner plans, not accusations or hidden debts. The farmhouse in Connecticut still stood. Margaret's will remained updated. Edward's divorce finalized without spectacle. Diane's silence persisted, not from resolution but from consequence. Grace understood now that exposure had not been revenge. It had been alignment, facts matching reality. She had not dismantled her family, she had removed deception from it. Whatever relationship might exist in the future would depend on accountability, not denial. For the first time in her life, Grace did not measure herself against her mother's disappointment or anyone else's expectation. She measured herself by the stability she built, the boundaries she kept, and the truth she refused to surrender. The bill that once attempted to define her had no authority left. Her balance was settled, and her life moved forward on terms she chose. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story resonated with you, remember this: truth doesn't destroy families. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to stay silent for peace, it's to speak so you can finally have it. If you've ever been labeled the disappointment, the difficult one, or the problem child, know this: you are not what someone else was too afraid to face in themselves. If this moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like the video and share your thoughts below. I'll see you in the next story.